The jars are just garum, a brief video essay. Elden Ring was written and designed in part by George R. R. Martin. His big, cool lore-building technique is that he doesn't really write things in a concrete, straightforward manner. What he does is he reads a lot of mythology and history and ancient religious practices, and comes up with his own system of ideas based on that, and lets that system ferment in his brain for a couple of years, running kind of like a computer simulation until it's a huge mess of convoluted ideas that have been passed through generations like the telephone game. Aside, I can't really confirm that, it's just my inferences from enjoying his work over the years. This is why the mythology and story of Elden Ring feels like it could be a myth from the real world, because it's designed that way. Now this is why I started thinking about the heavy influence of pots on the story. For something so commonplace in the game, there really isn't that much lore explaining how they're made or why. There are some bits of lore, but what there is just gets us asking even more questions rather than answering what we have. This also mimics real life. Throughout history, things that were common were hardly ever written down. For one thing, if something is so common, why would you write it down? For another, historically, the people doing some of the more common things couldn't always write anyway. What does this mean? It means that important things throughout history can be very hard to find out from direct sources. Because there wasn't really a point where someone thought that writing down how to do those things and why they did those things would be particularly useful, since obviously you could always just ask someone directly. So what can we conclude from this? Well, we can conclude that the pots of Elden Ring hold a lot of significance to the story. So much significance that within the Elden Ring universe, their existence is just taken for granted. And as such, the vast majority of the characters in the game don't really care to talk about them much. And why would they? They already know about them, so for them there wouldn't be much to talk about in the first place. This is excellent show, don't tell style world building. So how can we find out about the uses of pots in Elden Ring? Well, we could read what little lore there is in the game and try to piece together a narrative only from that. Or we could do that and do what George R. R. Martin is doing and look at the uses of pots throughout history, both culturally and practically, and try to apply it to what Elden Ring tells us, see if we can come up with a better conclusion than just using lore alone. Let's start with controlled rot. Humans love making things rot. Look at bread. Almost everyone loves bread, and what do you need in order to make good bread? A leavening agent. Filling the bread with air pockets and making it rise. Now, you could use a chemical like baking soda to create the gases that make the bread fluffy, or you could just use what's already covering everything and is already floating in the air. Yeast. Yeast is a single-celled organism, a type of fungus that loves carbohydrates. When you mix flour, water, and yeast together and leave it alone for a bit in a warm spot, the mixture rises, known as proofing. This is because the yeast inside the mixture is eating carbohydrates in the flour and farting out less complex carbohydrates like sugars as well as alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. This process is known as fermentation and is a controlled form of rot. The CO2 that the yeast produces makes the bread rise, making it soft and nice to eat. But the less complex sugars are also easier for us to digest. This is why bread is so yummy. The rot actually makes the food more nutritious and better for us, and our bodies can sense this through our taste buds. Flies are also sensitive to this process, which is why you have to cover your bread dough when you make bread. That's just bread, though, and bread doesn't really show up in Elden Ring at all. Rot is prominent, though. But what else can rot make? Are there other types of relevant fermentation? I'm glad you asked. Yes, of course. It's what's on the thumbnail. Let's talk about garum. Garum is an ancient condiment that people still make today. They call it fish sauce now. Now, garum is fermented, just like bread, and it gets its name from the type of fish that you ferment. But it actually uses two types of fermentation: lactic fermentation and enzymatic fermentation. It's pretty simple to make garum. All you do is leave fish out in the sun until it starts visibly rotting, and then you throw it into a big pot, add a bunch of salt, your fish might already be salty, and seal it in with a lid so flies don't get in. A couple of weeks later, you strain off the liquid on top, which is the garum and is delicious and good for you. And you rinse any solid bits with water and throw it into a compost pile to use as fertilizer. This is known as the alec. Now, how does this ferment? There's no carbohydrates for yeast to eat, so how does this all break down into a liquid? Well, there are two ways. One, once a fish is dead, bacteria will start to break it down and decompose its body. Two, when this happens, the enzymes inside of its guts are released. The same enzymes you and I have in our digestive systems, which then begin to break down the fish's own proteins into less complex amino acids. The only problem is this can only happen with a specific pH range. These enzymes exist in the stomach, which is a very acidic, low pH environment. They still function outside of the range, but they tend to be much slower. Once the enzymes are released from the fish's guts, they can no longer function due to the less acidic environment and can't break down the fish into smaller, more digestible components. This is where lactic fermentation comes into play. There are some specific types of bacteria that are safe for us to eat. One of these is lactic acid bacteria, or LAB. This bacteria is special and is able to survive salty environments that would kill most other single-celled organisms. And like the name implies, it produces lactic acid as a metabolite. Do you see where this is going? Basically, we break down the fish a little, either by letting it rot, smashing it up, or both, and release a bunch of enzymes from the fish while encouraging the growth of lactic acid bacteria via the use of a warm, wet, salty environment, being a jar filled with brine. The acid from the bacteria then does a whole lot of things at once to help the garum develop. 1. Enzymes only work within a specific pH range, and lactic acid released lowers the pH of the garum, allowing the enzymes to work outside of the fish's guts. Garum is basically pre-digested fish. 2. The acidity of the lactic acid acts as a preservative, and it prevents other things like mold and harmful bacteria from growing inside the garum, which it will eventually do even in the salt. This also imparts a kind of tangy, sour taste that people like so much in, say, kimchi. 3. The bacteria itself functions just like the yeast did. It breaks down the fish, which adds even more nutrition to the garum, like B vitamins, and even creates glutamates. In my opinion, monosodium glutamate is by far the tastiest flavor. It's the essence of umami. I use it in everything, and this is what makes fish sauce so America-damn delicious. So, basically, by allowing our food to rot in a very specific way, we've made something that is very nutritious, tasty, and self-preserving, so it'll last a very long time. Is it a good thing that multiple cultures within the Elden Ring universe are somehow doing this process, sometimes to living people, though? We'll get back to that, but the rot by itself, because of its capacity to improve things as long as it's done in a careful, controlled manner, means that the lore implications aren't entirely negative. I mean, it is horrible, but they might have some incentive for doing it other than just punishment, be it metaphorical or magical or allegorical or whatever. There's something going on there. So what does this have to do with the jars in Elden Ring? Simply put, the giant jars in the game, known as dolia in ancient Rome, look like what was used to make and store garum. Not only that, but they pretty explicitly show that this is what the jars are used for. They don't use fish, though. My theory is that the jars were primarily made below the earth, in the jails, before being hauled up to bake in the sunlight in hopes they might turn into fertilizer for a tree that would reach the heavens. Or perhaps a divine sacrifice to please the gods. In the main game, one of the easiest places to find a bunch of jars is in the vicinity of a minor Erd tree. They're not so coincidentally usually guarded, either by a Erd tree avatar or by something else that understands their worth. It would seem the jars served as a fertilizer for the trees that we see in the game, and that the prepared jars may have been fetched from a great distance and laid at the roots of the trees in order to feed them. Some minor Erd trees, like the one in Gelmir, don't actually even have a hoard of jars beneath them, but do have a wealth of bodies littering the soil surrounding, strengthening the connection from corpses to fertilizer to jars. This shouldn't be surprising. We know what the jars are made of, and we also know what fertilizer is made of. The real rub of the whole issue is that wax seal on top, the one that keeps it sealed away, though presumably judging from Alexander's actions, there are always ways to stuff in more meat after the fact. This implies, at least to me, that the contents of the jars were intended for the gods rather than mortal appetites. The fact that garum is ancient enough to be depicted in Roman art leads me to believe that this inspired Miyazaki and Martin to design the jars themselves after those, literally and figuratively sealing Marika's horrible fate, as well as everyone else she was ever close to before her apotheosis, in a jar. Look at the crucible. That's basically a jar for molten metal, and that's what the shamans basically already are, molten metal. That divine primordial soup is something that seems to be replicated by the massive growth that comes out of the jars. The process of being a saint-like form of punishment does imply some sort of purification is going on with this fermentation and separation, with all of the fertilizer sinking to the bottom and the metallic soul potentially rising to the top to be decanted and served to the gods as garum. I hear you asking, why does it matter if it's garum or not? I have one answer for you, and it's going to shake the very foundations of the Elden Ring lore community. This may crack open every long-standing mystery remaining and stab directly at the beating heart of the truth ensconced at the core of the game, already pierced through with an aqua regia-colored lance. Oh, yes. Are you fucking ready for this? This isn't about the garum's alec, the solids that remain after the liquid's filtered off, and they're used as fertilizer. That's for the nerds who came here expecting this to be a science video. No. We know each other better than that by now, don't we? Come on. It's because they were hungry. That is exactly right. I'm going to say it again. They were fucking hungry when they designed the people being stuffed into jars thing. There's simply no other explanation for it. Garum was considered to be a prized delicacy because of how good it tasted, and no wonder. It's prepared with enough salt to annihilate any bitter flavors that could result from the fermentation, leaving only highly concentrated umami. Remember when I talked about the signs of the alchemical stages in Elden Ring, back in the gold video? If you don't remember, go check that video out. It's way more popular than this one. Anyways, where was I? Right. This is literally the putrefaction step, which precedes all the other steps, and represents the first step towards the process of self-perfection, that is alchemy. If tree sap and edible sugar can represent sacred objects capable of storing divine power, it can't be surprising that the products of cutting up and sealing certain people in jars to ferment is capable of germinating and/or fueling the growth of a minor Erd tree, which, if they predate the age of the Erd tree and exist first in the lands of shadow, that can't always have been why they were created, can they? That one echo refers to the horrific punishment as an honor because it is nigh unto sainthood. Were trees as big as the minor Erd trees simply cultivated in the age before the Erd tree? Dispassionately, and without the reverence that would be seen in the Erd tree's followers. Because they were attempting to make a godlike entity, or form some sort of connection to one? They absolutely understood the crucible as a source of divinity, and seemingly designed these jars to be equal parts fermentation vessel and potentially heated crucible, judging by the fact that part of Alexander's quest involves him sitting in a literal lava flow to seal himself back together. These are definitely built to withstand high temperatures. Evidently, the Elden Ring itself involves melting and pouring molten gold, representing the distilled essence of thousands, millions of souls, with the distinctive arcs we've come to recognize strongly resembling the pouring of liquid gold from the spout of a crucible. Think about it. They had rituals to cause beings to possess individuals who knew the dance and could become divine beasts, so they clearly had a direct relationship with their gods. Were they aware of the existence of outer gods and sought to reproduce the phenomenon by using the jars? After all, the very divine gate itself is made of bodies mulched together and turned into a platform and archway. Another seeming proof of concept for the attempts to access divinity through Jarhud. And what is it that's marked as divine in this world? Well, if we go by the healing items presented to us, was largely sweet things and preservatives. Amber being a strong through line in both, which is made of sugar and can freeze anything it traps as if in stop time. I wouldn't go so far as to call garum sweet, though it is fermented and simple sugars are going to be present. No, it isn't sweet, but it is absolutely a preservative, much like the pickling liquid used to prepare certain organs for restorative properties and buffs. I mean, if it could be useful to the player, why wouldn't it be useful to the creatures in the game world, to the plants and the animals, all the way up to the very outer gods themselves? What if the soul fermented along with the body and produced a nectar that even an outer god was unable to resist, like food for a star turned amber? Since I've already theorized that the Erd tree migrated through space and pierced the Shadu tree to tap it for its life-giving golden sap, I think we've firmly established that powerful eldritch beings can and will cross the void between worlds in order to get a tasty meal. Everyone's gotta eat. This was valuable all the way back to ancient Rome, which we know for sure is the time period targeted by Elden Ring thanks to the tireless work of people like the Tarnished Archaeologist. The reason it was valuable is simple. It's a tasty preservative as well as a fertilizer. You can very easily use the whole bird, to quote Folding Ideas, twice. When performed with people, well, it's about as valuable as you'd expect from a delicacy that's made from the shamans, who seem to have some sort of inherent magic to their cells, judging by the trees they grow after being processed into jars. That's why the Elden beast ate Marika Radagon, and that's why the serpent ate Rykard and they fuse bodies. That's why the jars grow trees and summon holy energies. Because, as gross as this may be to say about jars filled with people, they are unfortunately supernaturally tasty, and Miyazaki and Martin were probably very hungry when they came up with them. Let's take a quick rundown and see if you agree. So what do the jars we find in the game look like in a historical context? Well, the giant pots are dolia. Dolia was used for food storage, like garum and wine. So what context do we then see them in the base game of Elden Ring? Lots of jars gathered around the roots of minor Erd trees, possibly used as fertilizer. Many empty jars that are exclusively in the vicinity of such Erd trees. There's also Jarberg, which shows us that jars are citizens of the lands between like any other, and have a place to call home, as well as families and the possibility of bearing children? Like Jarbane? Question mark? Moving on. Jars in the lands between appear to be an honor for dead heroes, given the rhetoric of Iron Fist Alexander as well as the presence of that one great jar directly in front of the Caelid Coliseum. Everyone else is bodily absorbed and reborn by the Erd tree. Ultimately, everyone is tree food. Some people are just getting made into sauce before they're used to water the roots. So what can this sauce be used to tell us about Elden Ring? Let's start with history, since we know Martin and Miyazaki both love to reference real-world history in their respective works before Elden Ring. So, how is garum used historically? Similarly to soy sauce or Worcestershire, everyone in Rome used garum, from the peons to the senators. It was used in a wide variety of dishes, to the point where there were numerous factories dedicated to its manufacture as well as brand names, for it was also a highly valued trade commodity. Again though, they used fish. Just feel I need to stress that point. It was profitable enough to have entire towns dedicated to its production and distribution, exactly like we see in the Shadowlands, but it was made with fish. It's Martin and Miyazaki who came up with using people for this. Romans were brutal and all, but they used fish. Anyways, how does this relate to the lore in the game? Well, the first canonical use of jars is in the Shadowlands. Hornsent put sinners into jars, while also introducing enzymes and bacteria, controlling the rot. They did this using the teeth whips, and were not particularly gentle about it. They stuffed the sinner meat into jars, the meat ferments, turns into garum. Now this, for some reason, is considered to be saint-like, a great ordeal of suffering in exchange for divine favor. First, the jars are used to turn sinners into garum. Then, persecutors use this to punish the persecuted shaman, and also use them as a resource. It's possible these jars were used for trade, and or fed to divine beasts directly, as we do see jar jails in the vicinity of the Divine Beasts Theater. Then, these sinners rise up, and Marika comes into power and overthrows the Hornsent. It is at this point, having defeated the last of their forces, that she arrives at the Divine Gate and becomes a god, completing her domination of the Hornsent's most precious symbols that they would have fought the hardest to protect, and using their very corpses to ascend to divinity. The jar practice is then flipped on its head. People who were formerly persecuted and now live in the lands between keep the practice, which now represents a sort of heroic tribute reserved for the corpses of champions. Everyone else gets shoved directly into the tree's roots to be reborn and gets another chance at jar burial that way. In conclusion, jars in the lands between represent, as symbols, both an escape from samsara, the cycle of suffering, and Jesus Christ's cross at the same time, both a way out of the eternal cycle of the Erdtree reincarnation and the symbol of the god Marika's suffering at the hands of the Hornsent. Jarvana and the Jerusifixion. Thank you for coming to my TED.